Picture someone you know. Maybe it's someone from your last job. Maybe it's someone you see in the mirror. She arrives before anyone else. The parking lot is still half dark. She doesn't need to. She just does. Because that's what she was taught. That's the deal. You show up, you do the work. The rest follows. She volunteers for the projects nobody wants. She stays late when the deadline shifts. She answers emails on weekends, not because anyone asked, but because the work matters to her. She helps colleagues who are behind. She takes on more than her job description has ever required. She has never, not once, missed a deadline. And she is good, genuinely good at what she does. Promotion season arrives. Her name has been on the list in her own mind for 3 years. She doesn't say so out loud. She doesn't need to. Surely by now it's obvious. Then the announcement comes. Someone else gets the role. Someone who joined 18 months ago. Someone younger, less experienced. Someone who she has occasionally had to help when they were stuck. Someone who, if you asked her honestly, does not work as hard as she does. She goes home that evening and sits in her car in the driveway for a long time. Not angry, or not only angry. Mostly confused. Because she followed every rule she was ever given. She did everything right. And she is asking the question that millions of people ask every single year in offices and hospitals and law firms and classrooms around the world. What am I doing wrong? Here is where most career advice would step in with a cheerful list. Speak up more, network better, get a mentor, build your personal brand. But that's not what this documentary is about. Because before the tactics, before any of the strategies that actually work, there is a more fundamental question that rarely gets asked honestly. What if hard work was never the whole equation? What if the model we were sold, the model that said effort equals reward, that says if you keep your head down and do the work, the universe will eventually notice, was always incomplete? Not wrong exactly, but missing something essential. Something about how careers actually operate. Something about how value is perceived, recognized, and rewarded in the real world. Over the next 35 minutes, we are going to take that question seriously. We are going to look at the psychology of advancement, the organizational behavior behind who gets noticed and who doesn't, the neuroscience of expertise, the historical patterns of how people who became exceptional actually got there. This is not a documentary about working less. It is about working differently, about understanding the actual rules of the game, the ones nobody writes down, the ones that determine everything. Because once you see them, you cannot unsee them. And that changes everything. Section 1. The myth we were taught. There is a story we all received. It came from our parents, our teachers, our earliest understanding of how the world works. Work hard. Be reliable. Be humble. Don't boast. Keep your head down. The results will speak for themselves. It is a genuinely beautiful story. It is also, in the modern economy, dangerously incomplete. To understand why, we have to go back to where the story comes from. The Industrial Revolution created a world that genuinely rewarded consistent, measurable output. If you worked longer in a factory, you produced more. More production meant more value. More value meant more pay. The equation was almost purely mechanical. Time and effort in, product and reward out. Our entire educational system was built to produce workers for that world. Show up, follow the rules, produce the output, receive the grade. The grade becomes the degree. The degree becomes the job. The job becomes the career. Every institution reinforced the same fundamental message: compliance plus effort equals reward. And then the economy changed. Knowledge work, the kind most people reading this do, operates on completely different principles. A software engineer who writes elegant, maintainable code is not twice as valuable as one who writes clumsy code. They may be 50 times as valuable. A strategist who identifies the right problem is not proportionally more valuable than one who solves the wrong problem harder. They are categorically more valuable. In knowledge work, the relationship between effort and value is non-linear. It is lumpy, unpredictable, and governed by principles that the industrial model never had to contend with. But the story hasn't updated. We still teach children that grades reward effort. We still structure performance reviews around inputs as much as outputs. We still instinctively feel in our bones that the person who works the longest hours is the most deserving. It feels fair. It feels moral. And it is also, increasingly, disconnected from how the world actually allocates rewards. The sociologist David Grusky has spent decades studying economic mobility, and his findings are consistent and uncomfortable. Merit alone has never been a sufficient explanation for who advances and who doesn't. Context, visibility, relationships, and the ability to communicate value have always been part of the equation. Always. This does not mean the world is unfair and therefore hopeless. It means the map we were given was always a simplification. Useful at the beginning of a career, dangerous if never updated. The person sitting in her car in the driveway is not failing because she lacks talent or effort. She is failing because she is playing by rules that were designed for a different game. She is winning a contest that is no longer being held. So what contest is actually being held? That question has a more interesting answer than most people expect. Section 2. Mastery versus Busyness. In 2012, Robert Greene published what many consider his most personal and most important book. He had spent years studying people who achieved genuine mastery in their fields. Not just competence, not even excellence, but the kind of deep, original capability that makes others look at your work and feel something shift in their understanding of what was possible. What he found was not what the effort equals reward story would predict. The masters he studied, Leonardo da Vinci, Charles Darwin, Albert Einstein, Temple Grandin, Freddie Roach, did not succeed by working harder than everyone else in a general sense. They succeeded by working differently, by spending disproportionate time on the specific skills that created the most distinctive value, by developing capabilities that were not just good, but rare. Greene makes a distinction that sounds simple but has enormous practical consequences: the difference between being busy and becoming rare. Busy is the default state of most organizations. Meetings, emails, reports, status updates, cross-functional syncs. The machinery of modern work is extraordinarily efficient at consuming time and generating the feeling of productivity. You can be genuinely, exhaustingly busy for years and never develop a single skill that would be difficult for someone else to replace. Rare is different. Rare means you have invested deeply enough in a specific domain that you can do something that genuinely cannot be done at the same level by many other people. Rare means that when a particular kind of problem arises, your name comes up in the conversation before anyone else's. Rare means that your departure from a team or an organization creates a gap that is genuinely difficult to fill. Rare and valuable skills are, by definition, hard to develop. That is the point. The difficulty is not a bug, it is the entire source of the value. The cognitive psychologist Anders Ericsson spent 30 years studying the acquisition of expertise. His most important finding, later popularized by Malcolm Gladwell, was more nuanced than the 10,000 hours framing suggested. It was not simply the quantity of practice that distinguished experts from the merely competent, it was the quality. Ericsson called it deliberate practice, practice that specifically targets your weaknesses, that operates at the edge of your current capability, that involves immediate feedback and constant adjustment. It is, by design, uncomfortable. It is the opposite of doing what you are already good at more fluently. Most people, when they practice, when they work on their craft, actually spend the majority of their time in what Ericsson called autonomous performance. They do what they already know how to do. They work efficiently within their existing capability. It feels productive. It generates no growth. The person who has spent 10 years doing the same job has not, in any meaningful sense, 10 years of experience. They may have 1 year of experience, repeated 10 times. This matters enormously for the promotion question, because organizations do not promote people for being good at the current job, not primarily. They promote people who demonstrate the capability to operate at the next level, who show evidence through the quality of their current work that they are developing in a direction that creates value the organization cannot easily find elsewhere. Being busy is easy to see and easy to overlook. Being rare is hard to fake and impossible to ignore. But here is the first pivot point, the first place where this insight creates a practical question that most people never think to ask. In the specific domain where you work, what would it mean to be genuinely rare? Not just good, not just reliable, but the person in your field, at your level, in your organization, who does something that genuinely sets them apart. Most people have never asked themselves that question directly, because the effort equals reward story never required them to. The story said, do the job well, do it reliably, do it without complaint. It did not say, develop a distinctive expertise that creates irreplaceable value. The story was always missing that instruction. Section 3. Why visibility matters. There is a phrase you hear in organizational psychology that most people find deeply unfair when they first encounter it. Perception is reality. It feels cynical. It seems to reward the performer over the producer, the talker over the doer. And it is, if applied without nuance, exactly as corrosive as it sounds. But there is a version of this idea that is simply true and important. Organizations are not perfect information systems. A manager responsible for 20 people cannot have direct, real-time visibility into the quality of every person's work at every moment. What they have instead is a model, a mental picture of each person built from interactions, outputs they can observe, problems they know were solved, and the testimony of others. That model is not the same thing as your actual contribution. It is a perception of your contribution. And those two things can diverge dramatically in both directions. Robert Greene's study of power and influence in organizations is not, at its core, about manipulation. It is about the gap between how people think influence actually works and how it actually does. The uncomfortable finding is that excellent work, performed invisibly, often generates surprisingly little organizational momentum. Consider what organizational researchers call the attribution error of invisible contribution. When you solve a problem before it becomes visible to your manager, you receive zero credit for solving it. Because from your manager's perspective, no problem existed. Your competence has, paradoxically, made your contribution disappear. Meanwhile, the colleague who solves a visible, dramatic problem, even a problem that could have been prevented, generates enormous organizational credit. They become associated with resolution, with capability, with leadership. The person who prevented the fire and the person who put it out are not valued equally. The firefighter has a story. The fire preventer is just someone nothing bad happens around. This is not a conspiracy. It is a feature of how human cognition processes organizational information. Benjamin Franklin, who, among his many occupations, was one of the most strategically effective political operators in American history, understood this intuitively. He famously cultivated relationships by asking people for favors rather than doing favors for them. The psychological mechanism, later confirmed by social psychologists, is that when you ask someone for help, they invest attention in you. They are now connected to your success in a way that giving favors never quite generates. He understood that how you are perceived by the people who make decisions about your career is not an incidental byproduct of your work. It is a strategic variable, one that can be influenced carefully and ethically by the choices you make about how you communicate, how you build relationships, and which problems you choose to be visible in solving. Here's what most people never notice. The colleagues who advance quickly in organizations are almost never the ones who work the hardest in a raw sense. They are the ones who work visibly on the things that matter most to the people who make advancement decisions. That is not a small distinction. It means knowing what your manager's actual problems are, not the problems on your job description, but the things that keep them up at night, the metrics their own advancement depends on, the gaps they feel most acutely. And then being, as visibly as is honest and authentic, the person who is closing those gaps. It means communicating your contributions in ways that translate into organizational terms, not boasting, but narrating. There is a meaningful difference between the person who quietly solves a problem and says nothing, and the person who solves the same problem and then provides a brief, clear update. Here is what I found. Here is what I did. Here is the outcome. The second person is not being arrogant. They are doing the organization the service of maintaining an accurate model of what is actually happening. Invisible excellence is still excellent, but it is much harder to reward. The ethical version of this, and there is a clearly ethical version, is simply to stop assuming that the quality of your work speaks for itself. Not because it doesn't, but because the organization has imperfect information, and part of your job is to provide that information accurately and professionally. Visibility without substance is politics. Substance without visibility is invisibility. The goal is both. Section 4. Deep work in a distracted world. In 2016, the computer scientist Cal Newport published a book that described something he had been watching happen to knowledge work for years. A quiet, largely unmeasured disaster. The disaster was distraction. Not the dramatic, obvious kind, not the failure to show up or the inability to focus under pressure. The ordinary, normalized, entirely socially acceptable kind of distraction that constitutes the default operating mode of most modern knowledge workers. Newport draws a distinction between two types of professional activity. Shallow work is the connective tissue of modern work. Emails, meetings, status updates, quick reviews, the constant, gentle hum of responsiveness that makes you feel engaged and useful and slightly overwhelmed at all times. It is valuable. It is necessary. And it rarely, on its own, produces the kind of output that changes careers. Deep work is different in kind. It is the state of cognitively demanding concentration, hours of uninterrupted focus on a single difficult problem, that produces work that is genuinely hard to replicate. The insight that reframes a strategy. The code that elegantly solves what seemed insoluble. The analysis that sees what everyone else in the room missed. Here is the uncomfortable finding that Newport documents with systematic evidence. The capacity for deep work is becoming rarer in organizations at exactly the moment when its economic value is increasing most rapidly. Rare things that are becoming rarer in a world where they are becoming more valuable. This is the definition of a competitive advantage. Neuroscience offers a useful framework for understanding why distraction is so costly in knowledge work. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for complex reasoning, long-term planning, and creative synthesis, requires significant metabolic resources and, crucially, time to reach full engagement with a demanding problem. Cognitive science research consistently shows that switching attention between tasks, even briefly, even voluntarily, incurs what researchers call attention residue. Part of your attention remains on the previous task for minutes after you've moved on. Your effective cognitive capacity for the new task is meaningfully reduced. This means that a 4-hour block of focused work is not interchangeable with 8 two-hour sessions interrupted by emails and Slack messages. The mathematics of cognitive output simply doesn't work that way. The interruptions don't just cost you the minutes they consume, they cost you the depth of concentration you were building. Most people, in most organizations, never have 4 uninterrupted hours of anything. The open plan office, designed to facilitate collaboration and spontaneous connection, has been documented in multiple studies to produce exactly the working conditions most hostile to the kind of deep concentration that produces high-quality knowledge work. Cal Newport's central argument is that in the modern economy, the ability to focus deeply on cognitively demanding work is a skill, and like all skills, it can be developed. Unlike most skills, almost nobody is developing it. Think about the last time you worked at the edge of your cognitive capability for more than 2 uninterrupted hours. Not busy, not multitasking, not responsive, just fully present with a single difficult problem, giving it everything your brain actually has. For most people, the honest answer is rarely or never. But here's what this means for the promotion question. The people who do develop this capacity, who deliberately protect their most cognitively valuable hours from the tyranny of the inbox and the meeting calendar, produce output that is qualitatively different from the people who don't. Not slightly better, different in kind. Newport calls this career capital, the rare and valuable skills you accumulate through deep, deliberate practice. It is exactly the same concept Greene arrives at from the direction of historical biography. The mechanism is the same. The practice produces rare skills. Rare skills create genuine leverage. Leverage creates options, including the option of being too valuable to overlook. The practical implication is radical in its simplicity. Stop optimizing for responsiveness and start optimizing for output quality. Not less hard work, different hard work. Work that builds something that compounds. Section 5. Real Stories. In 1992, a 35-year-old Microsoft employee named Satya Nadella was managing a small team working on cloud infrastructure, a technology that most of the company's leadership did not yet believe was central to Microsoft's future. He was not the highest-profile person in the building. He was not running the most prestigious division. What he was doing was building genuine expertise in a domain that he believed, with a conviction he could not yet prove, would eventually matter enormously. He spent years developing rare technical and organizational depth in cloud computing. He built relationships across the company. He became known not just as a competent manager, but as someone who understood the strategic landscape of technology with unusual clarity. Someone who could explain complex trade-offs in terms that non-technical executives could use to make better decisions. He became, in organizational terms, someone who solved expensive problems in ways that were genuinely difficult to replace. In 2014, when Microsoft's board needed a new CEO, when the company was struggling with its strategic identity, when it needed someone who combined technical credibility with organizational intelligence and the ability to reset a culture, Satya Nadella's name was not on the initial shortlist. And then it was. And then it was the only name. His path was not the result of being the most aggressively self-promotional person in Microsoft's leadership pipeline. It was the result of having developed, quietly and over many years, a combination of rare skills, strategic relationships, and demonstrated judgment in a domain that turned out to matter more than almost anything else in technology. He had not become visible by performing visibility. He had become visible because the gap his departure would have created was simply too large to ignore. This is the pattern that repeats across the careers Greene and Newport document. The people who advance most powerfully are not the ones who manage their impression most skillfully. They are the ones who develop genuine capabilities that organizations need and who are sufficiently visible that decision-makers know those capabilities exist. Andrew Carnegie, who arrived in the United States as a 13-year-old Scottish immigrant with almost nothing, did not advance because he worked the longest hours. He advanced because he developed the habit, from his earliest jobs, of solving problems his employers didn't know they had yet. As a telegraph messenger boy, he memorized the names and locations of every significant business figure in Pittsburgh. As a telegraph operator, he mastered the ability to decipher Morse code by sound alone, a rare skill at the time, which brought him directly to the attention of Thomas Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Every advancement in Carnegie's career can be traced not to effort volume, but to effort quality and strategic positioning. The Toyota production system offers a different kind of example. Not a person, but an organizational philosophy that transformed manufacturing. The core insight of the Toyota system, developed across decades of deliberate experimentation in the mid-20th century, was that the most valuable thing workers could do was not to maximize output per hour, but to stop the line when they identified a defect. To surface problems immediately rather than pass them downstream. This was, in the context of post-war manufacturing culture, almost heretical. The conventional logic was that stopping the line cost money. The Toyota insight was that the problems you couldn't see were vastly more expensive than the time you spent stopping to fix the ones you could. The organizational consequence was a culture where the workers who advanced were not the fastest producers, but the sharpest observers. The people who understood their process deeply enough to identify the source of problems rather than just respond to symptoms. The lesson applies with uncomfortable directness to modern knowledge work. The colleagues who advance most reliably are the ones who develop a systems-level understanding of how their organization actually works, who can see problems before they become crises, who communicate those problems with clarity and appropriate urgency, and who come to the table with proposed solutions rather than just identified issues. They are not working harder. They are working at a different altitude. Section 6. The hidden rules nobody tells you. Here is something that every experienced organizational psychologist knows, and that almost nobody says plainly in a job interview or a performance review. Promotions are not primarily a reward for past performance. They are a bet on future performance. Your manager and their manager, when they are deciding who advances, are not asking who has worked the hardest. They are asking who is ready to operate effectively at the next level. Those are related questions, but they are not the same question. And the evidence that answers them is different. The evidence for past performance is largely backward-looking: hours, output, reliability, results. The evidence for future capability is necessarily more inferential: judgment, leadership, communication under pressure, the ability to navigate ambiguity, the quality of your relationships with peers and stakeholders. This means that many of the traits most relevant to advancement are ones that are not visible in the ordinary execution of most jobs. You have to create or seek opportunities to demonstrate them. Here's what most people never notice. The colleagues who advance quickly are often the ones who have found ways to do this systematically, who seek out projects with visible stakeholders, who volunteer for problems that involve coordination across teams, who take on responsibilities that allow them to demonstrate judgment under pressure rather than execution under supervision. Relationships are probably the most undervalued career variable there is. Not networking in the transactional business card sense, real relationships, the kind built through consistent, genuine contribution to other people's work over time. Peter Drucker, whose work on organizational effectiveness remains largely unsurpassed 60 years after it was written, identified the central paradox of organizational life. The person who is technically excellent but organizationally isolated is less effective than the person of moderate technical skill who is deeply embedded in relationships of trust and contribution. Not because relationships substitute for competence, they don't, but because in complex organizations, almost everything consequential requires coordination. And coordination requires trust. And trust is built over time through relationships. The practical translation. The colleagues who seem to know what is happening in the organization before it's announced, who get asked into conversations that their formal role doesn't require them to be in, who seem to have influence that their title alone doesn't explain. They have invested, intentionally or intuitively, in a relationship network that creates access, information, and goodwill. Emotional intelligence is the silent multiplier of career outcomes. The person with strong emotional intelligence and moderate technical skill will, in most organizational environments, outperform the person with exceptional technical skill and poor emotional self-awareness. Not because emotional intelligence is more important than expertise, but because in human organizations, the inability to navigate relationships effectively creates a ceiling that technical excellence alone cannot raise. Ownership is another principle that consistently separates rapid advances from people who plateau. Not ownership in a legal sense, ownership in a psychological sense. The difference between the person who does what they were asked to do and the person who takes responsibility for the outcome. The person who does what they were asked will say, "I completed the analysis you requested." The person with ownership says, "I completed the analysis, and there are two things in it that I think we should discuss before we proceed, because they could affect the decision significantly." The first person did the job. The second person demonstrated that they understand the purpose of the job, that the analysis exists not for its own sake, but to support a decision, and that a good analysis surfaces the things that might complicate that decision rather than presenting a clean narrative. Organizations advance people who demonstrate that they understand the purpose behind the task, not just the task itself. Strategic patience deserves a mention because it is the most unsexy and perhaps the most important principle on this list. Careers are long. The people who play them most effectively are often not the ones who optimize aggressively for each individual opportunity, but the ones who maintain a consistent direction over years and decades, building skills, relationships, and reputation in a coherent direction that compounds. The frustrating truth is that the game most worth playing takes longer to show results than the performance review cycle. Section 7. How to become promotion-worthy. Everything we have covered leads to a set of principles that are practical, evidence-based, and immediately applicable. Not a checklist, a philosophy. A different way of approaching your career that changes the texture of every decision you make within it. Build rare skills, not more hours. Identify the one or two capabilities in your field where genuine depth would create disproportionate value. Not the skills that are pleasant to develop or already somewhat natural. The ones that are difficult and specific, and that not many people in your environment have invested in at depth. Then invest in them with the deliberate practice that Erickson documented. Targeted, uncomfortable, feedback-rich development that specifically addresses your current weaknesses. James Clear's research on habit formation offers a useful frame. The goal is not to make a decision to develop a rare skill. It is to build systems that make deliberate practice the default behavior, day after day, until the compound interest of that consistency produces capability that was not there before. Document your impact, not your effort. Keep a running record of the outcomes your work produces. Not the hours you invest, not the tasks you complete, but the measurable or observable results. What did this analysis inform? What problem did this project solve? What was the cost of the issue I identified before it became a crisis? This documentation is not for boasting. It is for your own clarity and for the moments, performance reviews, career conversations, interviews, when you need to translate your work into organizational terms. Communicate contributions professionally and proactively. The difference between self-promotion and professional communication is purpose and frequency. A brief, factual update, here is what I've been working on, here is the outcome, is not immodest. It is organizationally responsible. It keeps decision-makers' models of your contribution accurate. Do it consistently, concisely, and without expectation of immediate return. Seek difficult projects with organizational visibility. The projects that feel uncomfortable, the ones involving unfamiliar domains, cross-functional complexity, high stakes, or uncertain outcomes, are the ones that generate the most career capital. They require you to operate at the edge of your capability, which is where growth happens. They involve stakeholders beyond your immediate manager, which expands your relationship network. And they create the most visible evidence of judgment under pressure, which is precisely what advancement decisions are looking for. Develop strategic relationships intentionally. Think beyond your immediate team. Who are the people in your organization whose problems and priorities most influence what gets resourced, what gets recognized, what gets advanced? Not for transactional purposes, for contribution purposes. Find ways to genuinely add value to their work, to understand their challenges, to become someone whose judgment and perspective they find useful. Relationships built through contribution compound in ways that relationships built through proximity alone never do. Think like an owner, not a contractor. The contractor completes what is requested. The owner thinks about purpose and outcome. Before you deliver any piece of work, ask, what decision or action is this meant to support? What would make this more useful, not just more complete? What are the things someone reviewing this needs to know that are not obvious in the deliverable itself? The habitual practice of asking these questions changes the quality of everything you produce. Become known for solving expensive problems. Every organization has problems that are known and chronic, issues that cost time, money, relationship capital, or strategic clarity on a recurring basis. The person who develops a reputation for solving these problems, not managing them, not working around them, but actually resolving the underlying cause, acquires organizational influence that is very difficult to take away. It is the organizational equivalent of becoming rare. Increase leverage, not hours. Leverage means that the effort you invest produces outcomes disproportionate to the time it consumes. High leverage activities include developing skills that multiply the quality of all your subsequent work, building relationships that create access, information, and collaboration opportunities, and identifying the highest impact problems in your environment rather than the highest volume ones. More hours on low leverage activities produces more output. The same hours on high leverage activities produces better outcomes. Read people. Not in a manipulative sense, in an empathic, curious sense. Understand what your colleagues are actually trying to accomplish. Understand what pressures your manager is navigating. Be the person who makes others feel understood and supported, not the person who is technically competent but organizationally expensive to work with. Emotional intelligence is not a soft skill. It is a core competency for anyone whose work requires coordination with other human beings, which is almost everyone. Play the long game. The career that looks like a series of aggressive tactical moves for each available opportunity often produces less than the career built with patient consistency in a coherent direction. Decide as clearly as you can what kind of contribution you want to be able to make in 10 years, what rare skills, what reputation, what depth of expertise you want to have accumulated. Then make the decisions today that move you in that direction, even when they don't optimize for the most immediate reward. The compounding is real, but it requires time to become visible. The mindful reflection. Let's go back to the parking lot. She is still sitting in her car. The driveway is quiet. The house lights are on. She has done nothing wrong. That is not the right frame. She has done everything she was taught to do, with integrity, with care, with real commitment to the quality of her work. That is not the problem. That is, actually, the foundation. What she has not done, what the story she was given never equipped her to do, is understand the full landscape of the game she is playing. She has been investing in effort at a time when organizations are looking for leverage. She has been performing reliability at a time when they are looking for judgment. She has been producing invisibly at a time when visibility and substance need to work together. None of this is her fault, and all of it is within her power to change. Working hard is honorable. It is necessary. It is the price of admission to any serious career. But it has never been sufficient. Not in the way the story suggested. Not in the way we were taught to believe. The people who advance most powerfully, who build careers that are genuinely difficult to ignore, do not simply work harder. They work on things that are genuinely rare and valuable. They make their contributions visible without becoming performers. They invest in relationships through contribution rather than transaction. They protect the cognitive depth that produces their best work. They think about the purpose of their effort, not just its volume. They play, in short, a longer and more strategic game. Not a manipulative game. Not a political game in the cynical sense. A more honest game. One that accurately understands what organizations are actually looking for when they decide who to advance. Robert Greene, in his study of mastery, describes a moment he calls the return to the beginning. The point in an expert's development when they have accumulated enough genuine capability that they can once again approach their field with the freshness and curiosity of a beginner, unencumbered by the anxiety of establishing themselves. They are secure enough in their rare skills to stop performing competence and simply practice it. That is the destination. Not a title, not a salary band, not the vindication of a promotion announcement. A quality of professional life in which your work is genuinely difficult to replace. Your relationships are built on real trust, and your career is moving in a direction that reflects your deepest capabilities rather than your earliest assumptions. That is what becomes possible when you understand, really understand, how careers actually work. She gets out of the car. She goes inside. Tomorrow, she will begin differently. Not harder, better. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly. If you were to map the last year of your career, not the hours you've worked, but the rare skills you've built, the relationships you've invested in, the visible contributions you've made to problems that actually mattered, where are you? And where do you want to be? Leave your answer in the comments, because I've found that naming the gap is usually the first step toward closing it. And if this documentary made you think differently about how careers actually work, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not because they're failing, because they're working too hard in the wrong direction, and a shift in perspective might change everything. Now, a question. We've spent the last 35 minutes talking about how to advance in your career, but there is a parallel problem that many of the same people face. You can earn more money, get the promotion, build the skills, become more visible, and still find, a decade later, that you have very little to show for it financially. Why does that happen? Why do so many people with good salaries, stable careers, and genuine discipline, still find themselves financially constrained in ways they cannot fully explain? The answer involves psychology, not math. It involves the invisible beliefs we carry about money, risk, status, and time. Beliefs that were built long before we ever drew a salary. In the next episode, we are going to explore a question that is, in many ways, the natural continuation of this one. Why most people stay poor, even with a good salary. Drawing from Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money and George Clayson's The Richest Man in Babylon, we are going to examine the mental models that govern financial behavior, and why the gap between income and wealth is almost always psychological before it is practical. If you want to understand not just how to advance in your career, but what to do with what you earn when you do, subscribe so you don't miss it. Until then, work wisely, build rare things, play the long game.